All right, welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping right into something today that is honestly completely mind-boggling. We're looking at a monumental 2026 biogeosciences study that tracks the ultimate billion-year lifespan of animal life on Earth. Specifically, we're breaking down this fascinating paper by Kunio Kaiho that builds out a massive quantitative framework to project exactly how, and more importantly, exactly when, our planet's incredibly diverse biosphere is going to permanently collapse.
So let's just dive right into the ultimate mystery here. How much time does animal life actually have left on this planet before the final curtain closes? For decades, the predictive models on this have been all over the place. Scientists were throwing out estimates anywhere from zero point 0.8 to a whopping 5 billion years. That's a massive margin of error, right? But what's so cool about this new research is how it pulls together data on solar luminosity, continental weathering, and catastrophic climate shocks to finally give us a highly specific, definitive timeline. We literally have a concrete expiration date now.
Now, to figure this out, we first need to track what scientists call metazoans. And if you're not familiar, that's really just the fancy biological term for all complex multicellular animals. We're talking everything from a tiny insect crawling in the dirt to a giant blue whale in the ocean. And yeah, that absolutely includes us humans. Metazoans first showed up between 500 and 700 million years ago. But to understand exactly when they'll vanish from the geological record, we can't just look at history. We have to look at the hard physical limits of biology itself.
For some perspective, let's set our baseline with Earth's current global average surface temperature. Right now, we're sitting at a very comfortable 14 degrees Celsius. This 14-degree mark is basically the thermal sweet spot. It's what currently sustains all those incredibly diverse metazoan ecosystems we have across the continents and oceans. But as this study so carefully maps out, this number isn't going to stay stable over deep geologic time. That baseline is about to shift and shift drastically.
Okay, so this brings us to phase one, the gradual suffocation. Our planetary clock is ticking. But the real plot twist of this paper, and honestly what totally surprised me here, is that it isn't just the sun eventually boiling the oceans that kicks off the end of life. It actually starts with a gradual suffocation. A lot of older models just assumed we'd get too hot and burn up, but the actual mechanism of extinction is way more complex than that. It heavily relies on how rising heat fundamentally alters the very air we breathe over millions of years. Let's look at the timeline. Over the next 1.5 billion years, our sun is steadily going to increase in luminosity. It's getting brighter and hotter, and this drives global average temperatures up through distinct, measurable climate phases. By the 0.35 billion year mark, our current climate phase just ends. By 0.7 billion years, we're hitting up to 30 degrees Celsius globally. Fast forward to 1.3 billion years, we're pushing 50 degrees, and finally, at 1.5 billion years, Earth reaches a scorching 70 degrees Celsius. Just imagine that. A world where the global average from the poles to the equator is 70 degrees. But remember, the heat is really just the catalyst for a much bigger problem.
Now check this out, because the relationship between these interacting elements over deep time is absolutely wild. Notice how the blue and red lines at the bottom, which represent dropping carbon dioxide and oxygen levels, how they perfectly mirror that rising orange temperature curve. As that temperature line steadily climbs over the next billion years, the atmospheric gases that complex life literally relies on don't just slowly dip, they completely drop off the chart. It's a direct inverse relationship that spells utter disaster for the biosphere.
And that leads us directly to phase two, the plant crisis. There's a huge irony here, right? We spend our days right now just justifiably worrying about too much carbon dioxide warming the planet today. But in the deep future, a hotter Earth is actually a disaster, because it causes CO2 levels to absolutely plummet. The sun's rising heat triggers this catastrophic chain reaction that alters our atmosphere, leading to a massive global plant crisis. And, too little CO2 ultimately destroys the entire food chain.
Let's walk through this deadly cascade, because the mechanics are fascinating. First up, hotter temperatures drastically speed up what's known as continental rock weathering. Think of this chemical weathering process like a giant planetary vacuum, just stripping CO2 right out of the air. Once atmospheric CO2 drops to 0.15 millibars, C3 plants, which is basically almost all of our trees and forests, they just completely die off. As it drops even further to 0.01 millibars, even the super hardy C4 plants collapse. And here's the fatal blow. Without plants around to photosynthesize, global atmospheric oxygen slowly starves out, plummeting well below 1% of present levels. The planet essentially stops breathing. Which triggers phase three, the fast killers. Gradual warming and oxygen starvation are horrible, for sure, but they really only half the story. If we really want to understand the exact extinction timeline, we have to look at the abrupt killers. See, the slow loss of CO2 and oxygen leaves the biosphere incredibly weak and vulnerable. It's hanging by a thread. But what actually pushes life completely over the edge are sudden, violent disruptions to the Earth's system.
The study reveals this terrifying 1-2 punch. First, you've got the gradual weakening of life by solar warming, steady CO2 drawdown, and oxygen depletion over hundreds of millions of years. Then, this already weakened state is abruptly punctuated by catastrophic shocks. We're talking massive, large-scale volcanic eruptions or giant asteroid impacts. Historically, these sudden events caused massive extinctions by injecting aerosols that briefly cool the Earth, followed by extreme greenhouse warming spikes. In the deep future, when the Earth is already sweltering and completely oxygen-starved, these sudden thermal spikes become completely lethal.
So the crucial point here is that these sudden volcanic or impact events eventually push the global temperature past a hard physiological limit, 46 degrees Celsius. What's awe-inspiring and frankly pretty terrifying about this number is how universal it is. Whether an animal is a tiny insect on land or a massive fish in the sea, 46 degrees is the hard stop. At this exact temperature, proteins physically begin to denature. Metabolic processes just fundamentally fail. Sustained survival simply becomes biologically impossible across the board.
And that brings us to phase 4, the final extinction. When you combine the suffocating lack of oxygen from the plant crisis with these sudden, violent temperature spikes shooting past that 46-degree limit, you get a definitive, unavoidable endpoint for complex life on Earth. The gradual and the sudden combine to finally finish the job.
Take a look at this chart. See how the projected diversity for terrestrial and marine life actually hangs in there. It stays somewhat resilient until about 500 million years from now. Life fights hard to adapt, but then, boom. Look at the yellow, green, and blue sections representing insects, tetrapods, and marine metazoans. They literally cliff drop as these future mass extinction events become completely unsurvivable. The gradual suffocation softens everything up, and the extreme heat shocks just shear those diversity levels right off the map, reducing thriving ecosystems to absolute zero.
The model projects a very specific moment of doom. Right at the 0.9 billion year mark, a massive thermal event will act as a final kill switch. This event is going to wipe out the absolute last remaining terrestrial insects and tetrapods on land. The surface of the Earth becomes so profoundly hostile, lacking oxygen, lacking food, and literally physically cooking biological tissues that absolutely zero land families will survive past this point. The continents just become entirely barren of animal life. Now, what about the oceans? Well, because the deep oceans have a massive thermal mass, they take slightly longer to heat up to that lethal 46-degree limit. Because of this, marine metazoans get a brief evolutionary reprieve, but they too will completely vanish at exactly 1.0 billion years from now. By this point, even the deepest, darkest, coldest ocean trenches will fully succumb to anoxia and extreme thermal stress. The final animal on Earth will perish in the sea exactly 1 billion years from today. As the paper concludes, it is this specific deadly combination that seals our fate. To quote the study directly, the primary driver of gradual biodiversity loss is the long-term reduction of atmospheric CO2 and O2. However, extinction is completed by episodic warming events. It's a pretty profound realization. The slow atmospheric suffocation basically sets the stage, but the volatile, violent nature of Earth's geology delivers the final blow. I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder. Knowing that animal life has exactly 1 billion years left, how does it change your perspective on humanity's fleeting moment in this vast geological window? We have nearly 1 billion years left to marvel at the complex life on Earth, so what are we going to do with our chapter in the cosmos? This explainer really puts our daily struggles into an incredible geological perspective. We're just one tiny conscious slice of an epic billion-year biological narrative. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.